11th, 2001, a terrorist organization which was using Afghanistan as its base of operations attacked New York and Washington. In response to this attack, Canada joined an American-led coalition that worked to overthrow Afghanistan's Taliban government and that supported the transformation of Afghanistan into a free democracy. Canada also joined other countries in establishing tough new domestic anti-terrorism legislation that aimed at preventing any kind of presence of or interaction with domestic terrorist or designated terrorist organizations. So regarding the decision to overthrow Afghanistan's Taliban government, this was seen as just as a form of retaliation for the lives lost in September 11th, but it was also framed as a war for the liberation of the Afghan people. It was widely explained not as a war against Afghanistan, but as a war for Afghanistan, and in particular for the freedom of the Afghan people. The spirit of that period was one of profound optimism about the universality of the human aspiration for freedom and democracy, and about the possibility of external intervention quickly bringing about that democracy. This optimism was best expressed by then British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who said, "Ours are not Western values, they are the universal values of the human spirit. And anywhere, anytime, ordinary people are given the chance to choose, the choice is the same. Freedom, not tyranny, democracy, not dictatorship, the rule of law, not the rule of the secret police." And the implication in the minds of many seemed to be that we could use superior firepower to chase out the bad guys, introduce democracy, and then quickly move on with our lives. As Canada joined military efforts to support the transformation of Afghanistan into a free democracy, Afghanistan also became a major focus of Canadian development assistance. In this whole enterprise, we were motivated by the highest aspirations to sacrifice blood and treasure to allow women and men on the other side of the world to seize their birthright of freedom. But on August 15th, 2021, almost exactly 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, as the last Allied soldiers were pulling out of Afghanistan, Afghanistan was again overrun by Taliban forces. So as of this moment in time, at least, our great optimistic efforts to transform Afghanistan ended in failure. On the same day that Kabul fell, rather than being at his desk working on the desperately needed response to these unfolding events, our Prime Minister was visiting the Governor General to call a domestic election. An election that we did not need, that featured more polarization and demonization of Canadians than any in recent memory, and that returned a virtually unchanged Parliament. We would have been so much better off if the Prime Minister had been putting his responsibilities ahead of his perceived political interests. Now, leading up to the fall of Afghanistan, Conservatives have been calling on the government to use special immigration measures to assist the most vulnerable Afghans, those who had assisted Canada during the previous 20 years, as well as ethnic and religious minorities, such as Hazaras, Sikhs, Hindus, and Christians. In fact, the very first statement that I ever made in this House back in 2015 was to call for special immigration measures for Afghan minorities. The government's response to these calls has ranged from slow to non-existent, and lives have been lost as a result. But outside of the failures of our government, it's worth taking stock of what happened in general between September 11th, 2001 and August 15th, 2021. What caused the optimism for the expansion of freedom and democracy that drove nation building in Afghanistan post 9/11 to fade into the fatalistic acceptance of apparent global democratic decline that led the United States and other countries to leave Afghanistan and to effectively hand it back to the Taliban?
Un point d'ordre, l'honorable député de Repentigny.
L'interprète nous indique que le député.
The MP is noting that the MP is speaking so rapidly that it is difficult for the interpreter to physically keep up with the member.
Oui, alors.
We need a functional interpretation service so that everyone can understand. What I've understood is that the interpreter should have a copy of the notes. The honourable member says that the interpreter has received the notes. If that is not the case, we'll make sure that the notes have been received. The honourable member can continue his speech for now.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will, and it's my right to speak in the House. I appreciate that. Transforming Afghanistan was a great and noble goal, but doing worthwhile things is never easy. Supporting the democratic development of Afghanistan was always going to be a long process, and if it was going to work, then it required a long-term commitment. Tony Blair is right in an ultimate sense that people always ultimately choose freedom over tyranny. But the short-term optimism of the post-9/11 era did not pay enough attention to the need to gradually and painstakingly develop the institutions and political culture of a free, pluralistic society over time. We were too quick to want to declare mission accomplished. We cannot expect to simply chase out the bad guys and then roll out the template of free democratic institutions, because there is no single template for such institutions. The core problem was that so-called neoconservatism was not in practice sufficiently conservative. Conservatism in its essential form emphasizes the importance of local culture, tradition, and familial attachments. In order to succeed, the institutions and culture of free democracy must be built on that pre-existing local foundation. There is no single template for democracy, because democracy succeeds when it builds on pre-existing cultural structures that have existing legitimacy, which then confer that legitimacy on the emergent democratic structures. This is how democracy was successfully built in the West, especially in the Anglo-American tradition over a long period. If those advancing democracy elsewhere do not build on the existing cultural foundation, then there will inevitably be rival centers of power that compete for legitimacy with the new democratic institutions. In practice, neoconservatism was not sufficiently conservative because it did not sufficiently take stock of how deeply embedded traditions and authority structures need to be collaborated with and harnessed in order to build free institutions that are authentic to the local setting over time. Any work of external nation building requires both great patience and even greater humility. Free societies are not built like buildings, rather they grow like trees. Our own long history of halting democratic development in the West, building on pre-democratic foundations, should have made it clear to us that democratic development was always going to be a long-term project if it was going to be completed. In one sense, the work of securing democracy is never complete. As the saying goes, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Save for the possibilities of divine intervention or nuclear annihilation, there is no such thing as the end of history. That is as true in Afghanistan as it is anywhere else. The work of building Canadian democracy is not complete, and so why should we have expected it to ever be complete in Afghanistan? But of course, the hope of many, and rightly so, was that at some point along the way, external troops would be able to fully withdraw, and Afghans themselves would be the ones vigilantly guarding and defending their own freedom, no longer needing outside help. The critics of continuing Western involvement in Afghanistan believed that we needed to end so-called forever wars at a certain point and leave the country to its own work in this regard. But this framing of forever wars, I think, was highly misleading. American troops have been stationed in Korea for much, much longer than they have been in Afghanistan. Nobody considers that American presence in Korea a forever war. America's presence in Korea is rather a matter of a contingent of troops helping to guarantee the peace. The withdrawal of Americans from South Korea would create a significant heightened risk of catastrophic conflict. And so it is good for America to keep a contingent of troops there as long as is necessary. The nature of America's presence in Afghanistan was different, of course, than the nature of their presence in Korea. But the Western presence in Afghanistan was still consistent with the gradual drawing down of engagement, of more limited air support backing the Afghan army, of extremely low casualty figures in the later years compared to the height of the conflict, and a trajectory whereby a smaller and less costly presence could, over time, still help sustain local democracy and security. So the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban was not the inevitable result of facts on the ground. It was the result of a political choice that reflected a change in the Western mood. The shift from too optimistic, impatient interventionism without sufficient cultural understanding to too pessimistic, isolationist abandonment. As we have seen, the politics of isolationism and withdrawal, of putting domestic issues over external security imperatives, has led to global democratic decline, greater insecurity, and ultimately a higher risk of costly war. This is why, in an age of further threats to free democracies, we must be vigilant and active, embracing realistic optimism and strategic patience, and making the investments and the sacrifices that are required to keep the world a safe place for freedom and democracy. The quote I read earlier continues with the poignant line, "The spread of freedom is the best security for the free." I hear from time to time from constituents who want us to ignore events far away and instead to simply focus on challenges at home. But history teaches us that that impulse to retrench from the world always leads to the decline of democracy and liberty and to threats from abroad washing up on our own shores. And so when this spirit prevails, the long-term cost to our own well-being and happiness is inevitably much higher than if we had been engaged with international events from the beginning. I hope we learn the lessons of that history and we apply it. Now, as it relates to Afghanistan, we must now turn our attention to that other legacy of 9/11, the impact of anti-terrorism legislation. Anti-terrorism legislation was designed to confront the threat posed by violent non-state actors. Certain states do engage in acts that would fit any coherent legal definition of terrorism, but we have generally found it useful to maintain the possibility of some intercourse with hostile or rights-abusing governments, even those that use terrorism. The extreme isolation associated with terrorist listing was therefore designed for violent non-state actors as opposed to for violent state actors. This design has, though, been stretched and complicated in certain respects in recent years. First, certain organizations, like the IRGC or the Wagner Group, may simultaneously function as an international terrorist organization and as a part of or close affiliate of a state. In our view, these organizations should still be listed as terrorist entities, but we should acknowledge that such designations move us closer in the direction of capturing state-affiliated entities instead of just non-state actors with anti-terrorism legislation. Designating the particular organs of terrorism rather than the state itself still provides space for some interaction with other state organs and is therefore, in my view, quite doable even without amending the criminal code as it exists. But more complicated is the case in which a terrorist organization comes to occupy and function as the de facto authority in a state, and this is now the case in Afghanistan. Removing such an organization from the terrorist list would clearly send the wrong message and weaken legitimate and important sanctions against that group. Withdrawing the designation from a terrorist group once it takes over government would appear to suggest that one way for a terrorist group to get off the terrorist list is simply to take over territory. Again, that would clearly send the wrong message. But the criminal code as it currently exists was not designed for the situation in which a terrorist group also functions as the de facto authority in a state. So it is reasonable to look for ways to make these provisions nimbler, if that nimbleness allows us to preserve the listing of terrorist groups as terrorist groups. Rather than removing the terrorist designation from a terrorist organization that is still a terrorist organization, we should be prepared to thoughtfully amend the criminal code to still allow some presence in and engagement with the people of a country when that country has been overrun by a terrorist organization, without in any way legitimizing that organization. And this brings us to the particular provisions of C-41. C-41 allows the Government of Canada to grant very limited exemptions to the Anti-Terrorism Act to allow the delivery of humanitarian assistance in areas controlled by terrorist organizations. The legislation does not name Afghanistan or the Taliban directly, but it is clearly designed to allow the government to grant narrow exemptions that would allow the delivery of emergency humanitarian relief into Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan faces an ongoing humanitarian crisis, in large part as a result of Taliban misrule. Terrorists are generally not very good at running an economy. And yet Canadian charities have not been able to deliver essential humanitarian aid because in the process of delivering that aid to the Afghan people, they may run afoul of the Anti-Terrorism Act and thus risk criminal prosecution. In this particular case, we're not talking about the expenditure of public funds. We're talking simply about increasing the precision of criminal code provisions in order to give private Canadian charities the freedom to deliver private funds to the suffering people of Afghanistan. C-41 does not prescribe the precise form of the exemptions that the government will grant. It simply gives the government the power to grant these exemptions. It is reasonable for government to have this power to deal with contingency situations, although the government will necessarily be held accountable for their judicious and effective use of this power. Now, in terms of the basic objective of Bill C-41, the biggest problem that I have is that it comes too late. Not too late to be useful, but too late for many who have already been suffering under Taliban misrule for over a year and a half. Peer countries have been way ahead of us in addressing this problem, and Parliament has been pushing the government to address this issue for almost all of that time. In fact, immediately after the 2021 election, Conservatives proposed a motion to create a special committee on Afghanistan. When it reported to the House last spring, that committee recommended that changes be made to allow humanitarian assistance to get into Afghanistan. And following that, this past fall, the Foreign Affairs Committee unanimously agreed to my motion calling for changes that would allow humanitarian assistance to get into Afghanistan, reiterating what was in the Afghan Committee's report. And the committee adopted a second motion on the matter proposed by the NDP earlier in the winter session, and yet it is still taken until the end of March for us to actually begin debate on this bill. Now, when I've met with international development stakeholders on this bill, they emphasize a significant concern about timelines, and in a few different senses. They highlight the issue of timelines for the passage of this legislation and the hope that the government will choose to prioritize it within their legislative agenda so that it can indeed move forward. This bill does need to be studied and debated thoroughly, but we are prepared to move it forward as quickly as possible, provided that sufficient time is set aside for study and debate. While the principles are important, the bill is technically and legally complicated and does require meaningful examination. But stakeholders are not only concerned about the timeline for the passage of this bill. They are concerned about timelines that the bill creates for them in actually being able to get to work on the ground. Until this legislation passes, international organizations are potentially prohibited criminally from running humanitarian or development programs in Afghanistan, if there is some risk of any portion of those resources eventually ending up in the hands of the Taliban. This legislation allows the Minister of Public Safety to grant certain narrow exemptions. So from the perspective of these organizations, the legislation marks an improvement. But the process associated with accessing these exemptions is time intensive and potentially highly bureaucratic with no timeline set out. So again, it's not just about how long it takes to pass the bill, it's also about how long it will take organizations to actually be authorized to get to work. The proposed process is that an exemption can be granted after thorough review by the public safety minister, but only after the issue has been referred to that minister by another minister, either the immigration or foreign affairs minister, who will presumably have to conduct their own analysis. Exemptions also have to be granted for each individual organization. So if one development organization applies for and receives an exemption to operate a particular program, then another organization running an essentially equivalent program in the same or different geographic area will also have to apply for their own separate exemption. There is also a great deal of uncertainty about how widely an exemption would apply. Would an organization that got an exemption to run a program in one province in 1 year have to apply for another exemption to extend the program, run the same program in a different province, or run the program in another year? From my reading, there is a certain lack of clarity around the breadth of the exemptions that would be introduced. And multiple organizations doing essentially the same work would each have to apply separately instead of simply being able to proceed with their work based on an exemption granted to someone else. This process seems more bureaucratic and costly than it needs to be and raises questions about whether the actual exemptions will be in place in a reasonable amount of time. It also raises concerns about equity. Will the government subject certain organizations to more scrutiny than others? And will small and diaspora-led organizations be able to access these exemptions alongside larger organizations that have a longer history of working directly with the federal government? Conservatives have repeatedly highlighted the need to ensure the inclusion of small and diaspora-led organizations in our thinking about international development. It is perhaps natural and inevitable that certain trusted partners are more likely to receive direct government funding, but it would be a grave problem if small and less known organizations continue to face criminal prohibitions on delivering aid, while larger, better known players were given exemptions in identical situations. It would seem reasonable for the government to seek to establish certain general categories or situations of exemption which would apply to all organizations, rather than only grant exemptions on an individual case-by-case basis. We will be digging more into this specific part of the issue at committee. Although we feel there is an urgency around the timeline of passing this legislation, there is also an urgency to ensure that processes are streamlined so that we can get assistance to the people who actually need it as soon as possible. Now, when I've been consulting with Canadians about this legislation, some have asked if aid should be flowing into Taliban-controlled Afghanistan at all. We know that the real cause of the suffering of the Afghan people is their Taliban oppressors. Poverty is, in this case and so many other cases, the result of unjust and broken political institutions that prevent people from moving forward in freedom and security. So why treat the symptom when the cause of the problem remains in place? But to that, I would say what is true in Afghanistan is true in many places to a lesser extent, that poverty often is at the roots, it has its roots in injustice. When people cannot borrow against their assets because they lack clear title, when a primary breadwinner faces arbitrary arrests and doesn't have secure access to an objective justice system, when transportation routes of goods are not secure, when corruption limits opportunities, when teenagers can't go to school for fear of violence or on the way, these are all too common instances in many parts of the developing world where violence causes or perpetuates poverty. People everywhere have the ingenuity and the potential to lift themselves out of poverty if they are not held back by unjust systems that deprive them of the security, title, and credit they need to get ahead. So the fight for justice and for the recognition of universal human dignity is central to development and poverty alleviation. We need to recognize this reality, but we also need to attack poverty directly, especially in emergency situations like this. It's not always possible to go directly to the roots of a problem. In the case of Afghanistan, by choosing to abandon Afghanistan's security and the building of just institutions, we have cut ourselves off from the ability to get at the roots of the problem. But with those bad decisions already baked in, we should still do all that we can to save lives and eliminate the conditions elevate the conditions of the Afghan people. We should support such measures even while recognizing that the Taliban cannot be permitted to continue to inflict their reign of terror on the Afghan people, and the political problem will require an eventual solution. Delivering humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan is a necessary form of harm reduction, but we should not lose sight of the underlying injustices and political problems and of the need to look for solutions to them. So based on this, Madam Speaker, what can we say about the future of Afghanistan? Nobody can say what surprises will rest around the corner, but the Afghan people deserve our continuing support and goodwill. Continuing contacts between Canadian organizations and Afghans in Afghanistan help all concerned to be informed and create opportunities to respond to emerging issues and dynamics. We need to start by removing legal barriers that prevent humanitarian aid from getting in. Continuing access to food, education, and other essentials will provide Afghans some space to move forward. The involvement of Canadian organizations in this effort will mean contact and two-way awareness that could turn into something else down the road. we should retain some of the old optimism, because the intervening decades between 2001 and 2021 were not all for nothing. A new generation of Afghanistan has seen a different set of possibilities, and we will work together to ensure the reemergence of those possibilities. We must still look for ways to be there for them. And at the end of the day, we know the choice that Afghans will make when they are able. Because even if not with the right timelines and the right tactics, the main point was correct, that ours are not Western values. They are the universal values of the human spirit, and anywhere, anytime ordinary people are given the chance to choose, the choice is always the same: freedom, not tyranny; democracy, not dictatorship; the rule of law, not the rule of the secret police. The spread of freedom is the best security for the free. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his speech. We're seeing women's rights around the world under threat. I highlighted in my own speech the threat to women and girls and their rights in Afghanistan and how egregious they are. I find it a bit rich when the honourable member gets up on providing aid to countries that are in such dire need, when he's been such a vocal opponent of women's reproductive rights, and in particular filibustering a study at the Foreign Affairs Committee on providing resources for organizations that provide sexual and reproductive health in countries around the world. So I do hope that the honourable member will, I don't really have a question, Madam Speaker, I just wanted to make a comment on the need to be supporting women and girls in Canada and around the world.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
You know, Madam Speaker, we're less than an hour into debate on this important government bill on Afghanistan, debate that's, in my view, a year and a half too late. And it shows the partisan political approach of the Liberals to immediately try to throw this important debate of Afghanistan over the side and shift to something else. Beyond that, I would challenge the member to actually be aware of what's happening at the Foreign Affairs Committee. The study that allegedly I've been filibustering has actually finished now. We've been through 4 hearings at the Foreign Affairs Committee on that study, and I would invite the member to listen to some of the very thoughtful and insightful witnesses. We heard some witnesses from Western NGOs. We also heard witnesses from throughout the developing world that shared their particular perspective on these issues. So I would welcome the member to actually come to the committee. I've never seen her there before, to review the blues, listen to the witnesses, and maybe be aware of what's actually happening at committee before she tries to divert an important debate on Afghanistan with something else.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was listening to my colleague very attentively. If the government had been as quick to table this bill as quickly as the speech was given, I think we'd be further ahead. I'd like to congratulate him because I've never seen anyone give so many words so quickly. You'll know, Madam Speaker, that I'm personally involved with this bill. I've asked a great deal of questions on the matter, and we've been waiting for this bill for over a year. We have a lot of questions about the bill. One question that comes to mind for me is we need to ask authorization from many agencies and departments. It's not clear. In the bill, it says that the responses to those requests have to be given within a reasonable time by the Government of Canada. And I was wondering if my colleague trusts the government to respect a reasonable timeline. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Simpler matters, passports, immigration applications. The government has massively expanded the delays that we're seeing, and when we already have families that are being privately sponsored for refugee status having to wait for 3 years, we look at the government saying they're going to approve exemptions in a reasonable amount of time. We don't have 3 years to wait, clearly, to get these exemptions moving forward. It sounds from the question that my colleague from the bloc has exactly the same concerns that I have, which is around timelines. How long it's taken us to get this far, and how much longer it will take to get us not only passing the legislation, that's part of the process, but also getting to a point where organizations are able to implement programs.
Questions et commentaires. The honourable member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to comment how disheartening it is to hear members of the Conservative Party not acknowledging the importance of women's reproductive rights when we're talking about humanitarian aid. It's very disheartening. But I will move on. Clearly, the people whose bodies are not being, or reproductive rights of men are not at stake here. So I guess this is not important. I apologize. It's an important issue. Today, we're talking about how we need to ensure that people of Afghanistan are receiving life-saving humanitarian aid. And I wanted to hear from the member around whether he feels that the current bill that we are discussing, if the processes would create challenges for smaller aid agencies who don't have the same level of resources as smaller ones. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, we see the eagerness of Liberal and NDP politicians to shift the conversation to abortion. I'll just assure them again that there's a study happening at the Foreign Affairs Committee. 4 meetings have taken place. Neither of the members who have tried to divert this conversation about aid into Afghanistan to that issue have been at the Foreign Affairs Committee. I participated actively in that study. My comments are on the record. But I'd rather focus our discussion today on Bill C-41, which is the bill that's before the House. Bill C-41. And on this point, I agree with the member that there are some questions that this raises about small organizations and whether small, medium-sized, diaspora-led organizations would have as easy a time accessing these exemptions. And that's why I've raised this idea that how about if we say that if one organization receives an exemption to operate under particular conditions in a particular place, that another organization that's doing more or less the same thing would be able to benefit from the same exemption.
Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. And as my honorable colleague knows, I've been a bit torn on this bill due to my own past history and involvement in Afghanistan, and really due to my hatred of the Taliban. But I care deeply for the women and girls and Afghans in general. So I do believe we need to support this bill, but we do need to get it right. Tied to this, though, is in the Special Committee on Afghanistan, Recommendation 2 talked about the importance of interdepartmental coordination. This is a good example of a bill that's coming from public safety to change the criminal code, but it's going to tie into foreign aid, international aid, and policies within foreign policy. So I'd just like the member to comment on the complexities of this and how it'd be nice to know how the government is actually going to lead this effort to make sure, however it does get put through, it's done right.
Honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Great point from my colleague, and I, of course, want to recognize and thank him for his service. And I know that it's been inspiring for me to see how veterans develop close connections with the Afghan people and have been so instrumental in trying to support the Afghan people through immigration measures, as well as wanting to be part of the humanitarian response to the challenges that they're facing. The member is right that government can be so difficult to navigate, so complicated, and that applies to individuals, applies to organizations, especially smaller organizations that are trying to engage these processes. So I would just call on the government to do everything they can to minimize red tape, especially the red tape that organizations that are trying to engage the government have to experience. We want people to be able to get these exemptions done so that they can get programming out to those who need it. It's not going to be good enough to pass this legislation and then have a parade. No, we need to actually get all the way through the process so that aid can be delivered to people on the ground by as many organizations as possible.
Time for one more question. The honourable l'honorable député de Shefford.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I was at the Foreign Affairs Committee meeting where we debated sexual and reproductive health, and we heard testimony from women where organizations needed more help for women in Afghanistan who were victims of rape, who were going through horrible circumstances. Afghan community members have come to my riding office and talked about how slow the government process is. Beyond that, this is another example of what happens when we let religious values take precedence over scientific precepts. There are people whose rights are being violated. What they need is help through this bill. The Bloc will cooperate in order to accelerate the process. And we hope that when it comes to foreign affairs or foreign assistance, there are NGOs who want to see funding for the international feminist policy that's been promised.
Madam Speaker, there were a lot of different things in there. I do want to just comment, though. I mean, the member sort of had an implied criticism that this is sort of something going on about religious values in general. I just maybe just want to identify the fact that many of the leading development organizations in Canada that are working hard to get assistance to most vulnerable people around the world are coming from some kind of a faith-informed humanitarian motivation. Christian organizations like World Vision or Food Grains Bank, Muslim organizations like Islamic Relief. For many people, though certainly not for all, a commitment to a sense of the image of God being in all of us is what leads to a passion for development assistance. So I want to recognize the role of people who come from a broad range of philosophical backgrounds who are involved in international development and the important work they're doing.
Reprise de débat.